Chapter 16 Parotama Assault. I feel much better knowing that your husband is with Facade, Miranda, Queen Zelda said as she and her cousin walked through the corridor arm in arm. With Link having run off with that awful Sing all by himself, I didn't want my husband to leave at all. Even though the king had only been gone for a couple days, Zelda had felt a strong sense of relief when her favorite cousin had arrived in her carriage, since now she wouldn't have to be alone. True, there were plenty of guards and servants roaming the halls of the North Palace, but ever since spending all that time as Ganondorf's prisoner, the queen only felt truly safe in the presence of one of the ones who had stood up to him. Not that Zelda was helpless, at least. Not anymore. Over the past 5 years, she had been learning how to fight beyond simply defending herself long enough to escape, and although Facade had never gotten around to teaching her the sword, Link had taught her everything he knew about using a boomerang and a bow, while Miranda had been trying her best to pass on the hand-to-hand techniques that she had learned from Aghanim. The queen was not exactly proficient at using her hands and feet to subdue an enemy, but the boomerang had come naturally to her, as seen by her ability to knock the king off his horse without taking extra time to aim, and her archery skills were, well, they were getting there. The next person who tried to kidnap her was in for a surprise, not that Zelda wanted the opportunity to make good on that boast. Instead of focusing on all the negative feelings of the past, she and Miranda roamed the halls and corridors of the palace, catching up on everything that had happened in their lives since the last time they had been able to visit. Her cousin had already heard about the challenge that had been presented to the king, but was more surprised to learn the details about what Link was up to. As a member of the royal family, Miranda knew all of the legends, including the one about the first Zelda.
So he just ran off with her?
Miranda asked, somewhat in disbelief.
Did you tell him what Uncle Harkinian told us when we were children? You know, about Impa's son?
Impa told him that part, but he left anyway, Zelda replied as they neared the entrance to another chamber. Sometimes I think that man is too brave for his own good. But speaking of Impa, there's something I need to tell you, and maybe Aghanim can help? Relating the whole story about what the dark-haired magician had done to the elderly servant, the queen had expected her cousin to be concerned, but instead Miranda actually became excited to see the results of the spell. As her cousin rushed to open the chamber doors, Zelda was concerned that the now minuscule Impa would still be crying about her fate, but this was not the case when Miranda opened the doors. No longer sitting on the dresser and crying about having been turned into a fairy, Impa was instead crying out with excitement as she now flew around the room, diving and turning around obstacles as if she had been born with the wings that were now on her back. Around bedposts and underneath cabinets, she flipped and spun, dipping down to where she almost touched the floor before pulling up and then hovering right in front of the two ladies as they walked into the room.
Can you believe it, Zelda? Can you believe it?
Impa said in her now higher-pitched voice.
Look how young and beautiful I am! I can fly, too! She doesn't appear to be cursed, Zelda,
Miranda commented as the fairy resumed darting around the room, this time around each of the rafters.
In fact, I don't ever remember seeing her this happy.
The queen was about to say something, but was interrupted by a commotion that suddenly came from out in the hall. Leaving Impa to continue her flying around, Zelda and Miranda were met in the corridor by one of the servants who seemed distressed. After a couple deep breaths, he bowed to her and explained that there was a disturbance in the courtyard, and it had to be serious if the guards couldn't simply handle it themselves. So the two of them followed the servant down the corridor and stairways of the North Palace, all the way down to the front entrance, where the doors opened to see what could easily be described as a disturbance. There were two strange warriors in the courtyard, each wearing dulled armor that was adorned with what looked like bones, almost giving them the appearance of skeletons. The helmets ruined the image though, being bulky and decorated with horns, and the warrior on the right was carrying a large sack on his back.
We will not tell you again, vermin,
one of the warriors warned, kicking a guard in the chest and knocking him down.
Bring us your queen, or...
The queen is right here, Zelda proclaimed as she and Miranda walked down the stairs and onto the stone pathways of the courtyard.
What is the meaning of this?
Backhanding another guard who got too close, The warrior with the sack responded to her by opening it and dumping the contents onto the ground. Zelda gasped when she saw that it contained her husband's armor and weapons, and now the two warriors started laughing as they pointed their swords at her and Miranda. A small shield was attached to their arms, like the one Link carried, and now the guards were nervously taking a couple steps backwards from them.
"I bring you good news, your highness," the warrior on the left said while laughing. "Facade was successful in defeating Rabanok, but he was no match for the great boss Guma," the other one continued. "Once Karok took the wizard away, your feeble husband crumbled under Guma's might like a sickly child."
There was more laughing now, as the warriors gave an obviously exaggerated account of how Facade begged this Guma person for mercy and cried like a girl, but Miranda didn't seem as concerned about this as she did with what had happened to Aghanim, seeing by her quietly whispering the word Karok as if it were something she was scared of. Now the warriors were laughing again as they explained how Guma had ripped the armor off the king and had him dragged through the mud, before suddenly becoming very serious.
"Your husband has been defeated," the one on the left said coldly. "He is the prisoner of Boss Guma, and we, the legendary Parutamu warriors, have come to accept your surrender. Get on your knees, Zelda, and toss your crown at our feet," the other one ordered, gesturing down with his sword. "Declare yourself the slave of Boss Guma, and beg his forgiveness for what you did to his cousin, the almighty Ganondorf."
"I have a better idea," the queen replied quickly. "Tell me where Facade is, and then surrender, or the guards will kill you where you stand."
"Zelda, something is wrong here," Miranda whispered into her ear. "There's only 2 of them. Why are they so confident?"
With the queen's threat to back them up, the guards stopped backing away, and now even more guards could be seen appearing on top of the battlements and from the other entrances of the palace. However, even though the 2 of them were hopelessly outnumbered, the Parutamu warriors did not seem afraid. In fact, they started laughing again, even harder now, before raising their swords above their heads, and then letting out an angry scream as they stabbed the blades into the stone pathway. Zelda had seen Aghanim do something similar before, causing the ground to tremble as if an earthquake was happening, and just like with the wizard's spell, the queen, Miranda, and all of the guards were knocked off their feet. After a couple seconds, the ground stopped shaking, but at some point the sky had changed color, going from light gray of distant rains to a kind of greenish yellow that just felt wrong. Then it happened. Part of the stone walkway was busted out from underneath by what looked like a skeletal fist. It happened again, and again, and again. Small pieces of the walkway throughout the courtyard being destroyed by skeletal fists. Fists that were attached to skeletal arms, which were attached to complete skeletons that were quickly pulling themselves out from the ground. Each one was holding a sword in its other hand, with a mounted small shield like the 2 warriors were carrying, but other than that they were simply naked skeletons, who immediately attacked the nearest guards. Taken completely by surprise, the guards were starting to be overwhelmed by the skeletal warriors, especially since more of them were still pulling themselves out of the ground. This left the 2 Parutamu warriors free to rush after the 2 ladies. Reacting just as she had been trained to do, the queen took the boomerang out of the back of her belt and tossed it at the one on the right, only to have him raise his leg up so that the weapon flew right past instead of hitting his knee. The advance resumed immediately, with the weapon traveling for a short distance before turning around and coming back, but the warrior tilted his helmeted head to the side just before the boomerang would have hit, leaving it free to end up back in Zelda's hand. More and more skeletons were coming up from the ground now, and it would only be a matter of seconds before the last of the retreating guards were overwhelmed, so Miranda pushed her toward the door while yelling for her to run, and then from under the sleeve of her dress, her old hookshot was launched outwards. Moving his shield into the way at the last second, the spear on the end of the hookshot sunk into the metal instead of the warrior's chest, and then he pulled back as hard as he could, lifting Miranda off her feet. Instead of falling on her face, however, the queen's cousin retracted the chain, causing her to fly forward, and allowing her to tackle the left warrior to the ground, while the one on the right ran after Zelda.
you.